Welcome back to the deep dive. If you were with us for our last deep dive, we really set the stage for this tinderbox in 1754. We talked about the diplomatic fault lines, especially with the Iroquois Confederacy, and then that inevitable violent collision of French and British ambitions right in the Ohio Valley.
Yeah, and collision is the right word. It wasn't just some minor skirmish. This was, the match being lit for what would become a world war.
And it was messy. We left off with a very young George Washington becoming something of an international embarrassment.
Absolutely. His disastrous engagement at Jumonville Glen, which was then followed almost immediately by his surrender at Fort Necessity, it was just a complete debacle. It showed the incompetence of the English allies, and it really marked the moment hostilities truly began.
And the French didn't waste any time, did they? They were throwing down the gauntlet, reinforcing their position with those so-called logged forts, with Fort Duquesne being the crown jewel.
Exactly. So the question becomes, what does London do? The colonies have proven they can't handle it.
And that's what we're unpacking today. The metropolitan response to that colonial chaos. The ill-fated Braddock campaign of 1755. This wasn't a small-scale operation.
No, not at all. This was Britain's massive, confident, and, they thought, highly organized attempt to just impose control and end this thing quickly.
But it ended in a defeat so defining, so absolute, that it became known simply as Braddock's defeat for generations. It completely shook the foundation of colonial security.
So today, that's our mission. We're going to get into the weeds on the grand strategy, or lack thereof, the logistical nightmare that it became, and the really critical tactical errors that led straight to that catastrophe at the Monongahela River.
Okay, so let's start with the big picture. Why Braddock? Why did London feel the need to send a major general with 2 full regiments all the way across the Atlantic?
Well, the crisis Washington started made it impossible for London to stay on the sidelines anymore. For decades, really, North America had been a secondary theater, a bit of a distraction.
I remember reading that the Duke of Newcastle, who was head of the British ministry, he sort of viewed the American situation like his own gout.
That's the perfect analogy. He saw it as, distracting and slightly debilitating, but certainly not a mortal threat to the empire. He just didn't think the wilderness was worth a major war.
But that had to change. The French were building forts. They were serious. Marquis Duquesne wasn't just posturing. He was building a permanent presence.
Precisely. And the British colonies were, true to form, less interested in uniting than in jockeying for advantage. You had Virginia bickering with Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania bickering with Maryland. They couldn't coordinate anything.
So London realized they had to step in. They had to impose cooperation because the colonies couldn't or wouldn't do it themselves.
They had to. The American frontier was just too fragmented to save itself. And suddenly, North America went from this low colonial priority to a continent that was absolutely worth fighting over. The geopolitical stakes were just too high.
And the objective was clear.
Unambiguous. Fort Duquesne had to fall. It was the strategic key to the entire Ohio Valley. Take the forks of the Ohio, and you push the French north and show everyone that Britain means business. This wasn't a job for local militias.
Which brings us to Major General Edward Braddock. What kind of man was he? Because his arrival signaled a huge shift in commitment.
He was the embodiment of the professional European soldier, a veteran of the Coldstream Guards, steeped in that rigid, conventional European style of warfare. He wasn't coming alone either.
Right, he brought the 44th and the 48th regiments afoot.
2 full regiments brought up to strength. This was the largest single deployment of British regulars to North America up to that point. It was a message. This was a traditional European military response meant to solve what they saw as a strategic weakness once and for all.
So it wasn't just a tactical move, it was psychological. They were trying to project overwhelming power.
Absolutely. The mandate was simple: kick the French out of the forks of the Ohio, and in doing so, prove that British regular arms were superior to any challenge the wilderness could present.
And this is all happening in 1755, before war is even formally declared.
Right. They were hoping to present the world with a fait accompli, take Fort Duquesne, take Fort St. Frederick, take Fort Niagara, and solve the whole North American problem before the diplomats in Europe even got to the table.
It's just the sheer confidence that's so striking. He wasn't just bringing men, he was bringing the whole apparatus of European siege warfare. Heavy artillery, wagons, massive amounts of powder.
Which tells you everything about how they viewed the problem. They were convinced that professionalism and firepower would just roll over any wilderness chaos. It's fascinating because even the French foreign minister in Paris wasn't immediately alarmed.
Really?
Yeah, they'd been sniping at the English colonies for years. But the difference here was that Braddock was coming with such force and with such conventional expectations that his greatest strength, that European professionalism, was about to become his greatest vulnerability. He came to fight a battle of lines and volleys.
And the forest doesn't offer either of those things.
Not at all.
Okay, so let's shift to that reality check he got the moment he arrived. Braddock versus the colonies.
Right. And it was a clash from the very beginning. This is a man who is used to a clear military hierarchy. You give an order, it is executed, period.
But colonial governors in North America didn't see themselves as junior officers.
Not even close. His first big move was to summon the governors to a conference in Alexandria, Virginia. You had Dinwiddie from Virginia, Delancey from New York, Shirley from Massachusetts, a whole room of them.
And the sources say he didn't exactly ask for their help.
That's putting it mildly. It was a masterclass in how to alienate everyone. He didn't ask, he demanded cooperation. He expected these colonial assemblies, who were notoriously protective of their power of the purse, to just hand over money and men to a general they just met who was treating them with, frankly, metropolitan arrogance.
That had to create friction immediately.
Oh, it was a recipe for stonewalling. And Braddock fell right into this trap that a lot of metropolitan generals did. He saw their reluctance not as, legitimate political maneuvering, but as a sign of colonial inferiority, corruption, and rebelliousness.
And that resentment just made his biggest problem even worse. Logistics.
The core absurdity of the entire campaign. He was trying to wage a heavy European-style war in a roadless wilderness. The route from Wills Creek, which is now Cumberland, Maryland, was described as basically impassable.
He brought a supply train built for Flanders.
Exactly. And barely 3 days into the march, the whole column grinds to a halt. The wagons are too heavy. The artillery is sinking into the mud. The forest was just physically rejecting his army.
What did he have to send back?
Yeah.
Because that really shows the scale of the miscalculation.
He was forced to send back his largest wagons, 2 massive 6-pound howitzers, and 4 Kohans, which are small mortars. I mean, these are his siege weapons.
The very tools he brought to take the fort.
The very tools. And along with them, a huge amount of powder and shot he couldn't afford to lose, but couldn't possibly transport. It was a quiet admission right at the start that his entire methodology was failing.
And then there's the famous horse problem. He was furious about the animals he was sold.
He was. He cursed the colonials, said they'd sold him small and underfed beasts. He needed powerful draft horses, and what he got were basically nags. Even Washington, who was on his staff, admitted there had been vile mismanagement in regard to the horses.
So it's this perfect storm of colonial resistance, poor planning, and maybe just bad luck. But there was one colonial who stepped in to save the day, wasn't there?
Yes, and the irony is just immense. It was Benjamin Franklin.
Of course it was.
Franklin, the deputy postmaster general, saw Braddock was completely stuck. So he used his own network and his considerable charm to go out and secure 150 wagons and over 250 pack horses from Pennsylvania farmers. He basically saved the expedition from collapsing before it even really started.
So Benjamin Franklin, the symbol of colonial ingenuity, provides the means for Braddock, the symbol of imperial arrogance, to march to his death.
It's a powerful, powerful irony. But this logistical struggle had an even bigger effect than just slowing him down. It completely destroyed his ability to win over Native American allies.
Which was probably the most critical failure of all.
It might have been. His bluntness in diplomacy was just devastating. He held talks with Delaware and Shawnee chiefs. They were watching him, trying to figure out who was going to win and, more importantly, who would respect their land.
And Braddock didn't make any promises to protect their land from settlers, did he?
He did the exact opposite. He was brutally, unforgivingly honest. He told them, point blank, that this war was for the British Empire. Full stop. Once the French were gone, the land would belong to the British Crown, and they would decide what happened next. He reportedly said that no savage should inherit the land.
Wow. I mean, why would they risk their lives for a power that just told them they were going to be replaced?
They wouldn't. The French were, generally speaking, trading partners. The British were settlers, what the natives sometimes called locusts. Braddock confirmed their worst fears, and so they melted away into the woods.
It's amazing. He's an experienced general, but he showed the same fundamental ignorance that Washington had shown the year before, but he compounded it by actively rejecting the very allies who could have saved him.
And that rejection left him blind. He was ultimately left with just 7 or 8 Mingo guides and George Croghan, the traitor. That's it. 7 or 8 men to scout an uncharted wilderness against hundreds of warriors who knew every single tree.
The stage is set. It really feels like an inevitable disaster at this point.
It does. An army built for open fields, crawling through a forest led by a general who rejected all local expertise.
So despite all of this, the bad blood, the logistical mess, losing his allies, Braddock pushes on, and he's literally carving a road through the wilderness as he goes.
An incredible engineering feat, really, even if it was militarily insane. The pioneers were out front constantly, cutting down trees, leveling ground, just to make way for this enormous, mile-long European column.
Let's break down that column structure because it says everything about his rigid mindset.
It was almost like a parade. At the very front, you had his handful of scouts, the Mingo guides and Croghan. They were the eyes and ears.
Such as they were.
Right. Then came the advance guard under Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Gage. About 300 light infantry and grenadiers. They were ahead of the pioneers, the guys building the road.
And behind them, the main body.
The main body, the heart of the problem. It followed maybe 100 yards back. That was Braddock and his staff, and then 500 infantry marching in 2 parallel columns, flanking this long, incredibly vulnerable line of wagons, artillery, and camp followers.
And he sounds like a target.
Yeah.
A mile-long target snaking through the woods.
That's what it was. And at the very back, you had a rear guard of about 100 Virginia provincials under Captain Adam Stephen. They had flankers out on the sides, but only 100 yards out. The whole thing would just stop every 2 hours to form up defensively. It was all by the book.
The European book.
The European book.
And you have to imagine the conditions. A Pennsylvania July. It's hot, it's humid, there's dust everywhere, and you're deep in hostile territory.
And we can't forget about one key observer on Braddock's staff. George Washington. He was there as an aide-de-camp, and he was not well.
The sources are pretty graphic about his condition.
They are. He was described as very weak and low. He had a severe case of dysentery, and he was in agony from hemorrhoids. The accounts say he could only ride his horse by strapping cushions to his saddle. A pretty miserable situation for a 23-year-old.
But even though he's physically suffering, his mind is sharp. He's watching Braddock's every move.
He's absorbing everything. Washington was a huge student of military manuals, especially Colonel Humphrey Bland's treatise of military discipline. It was the Bible of European warfare. He was watching a professional army in the field, convinced this was the way to do things.
He was about to get a very brutal lesson to the contrary.
A spectacular, bloody lesson.
And by the morning of July 9th, 1755, they are incredibly close. Just 10 miles from Fort Duquesne.
And morale was actually high. They felt they'd overcome the worst of it. They were low on food, but they expected to invest the fort the next day. They honestly thought the French might have already abandoned it in terror.
That expectation of an easy win just makes what happened next so much more shocking.
It does.
Okay, so while Braddock is expecting an easy victory, what's happening inside Fort Duquesne? The commander there, Captain Contrecoeur, must have been panicking.
He was terrified. He had maybe 250 French Marines and militiamen against 1,400 British regulars with artillery. He was seriously considering just burning the fort and retreating north. He knew he couldn't survive a conventional siege.
And this is where Captain Beaujeu comes in. He's the man who changes everything.
He's the pivot point. Beaujeu was an officer who understood the Ohio Valley. He understood irregular warfare, and most importantly, he understood his Native American allies. He knew that their only chance was a desperate, immediate, preemptive strike.
He knew they couldn't just sit in the fort and wait.
Exactly. The warriors would never agree to fight inside a wooden box that was about to be pounded by cannon. So Beaujeu goes out to their encampment and proposes an immediate attack.
And what did they say?
They refused. At first, they were shocked. They told him, "What father do you wish to die and sacrifice us? The English are more than 4,000 men, and we are only 800. They saw it as a suicide mission.
So how does he turn them around? This is a real moment of leadership.
It is. He changes his tactics. He stops being a French officer giving orders. He reportedly puts on war paint, dresses as a warrior, and says something to the effect of, "I'm not asking you to follow the King of France. I'm asking you to follow me to fight for your homes." He made it personal.
And it worked.
It worked. He rallies about 800 men in total, roughly 650 warriors and 150 French troops, to go out and hit the British before they can get their cannons in place. The goal wasn't to win a pitched battle, it was to create chaos.
And they meet Braddock's army just as the advance guard under Gage is fording the Monongahela River.
That's the spot. The initial contact is fast, almost accidental. The scouts see each other at the same time, shots are fired, and in that first volley, Captain Beaujeu is killed instantly.
Which could have ended the whole thing right there.
It could have, but the native warriors were already committed. They didn't panic. They just instinctively fanned out into the woods on both sides of the trail, using the dense cover.
And this is the critical moment. Braddock hears the firing up ahead, and his professional training tells him to do exactly the wrong thing.
The fatal thing. He rushes the main body forward straight into the confusion of the advance guard. It violates the most basic military doctrine. You're supposed to stop, form a defensive line, and figure out what's happening. Instead, he just jammed his entire mile-long column into a narrow clearing.
Creating a traffic jam from hell.
A deadly one. The advance guard is falling back in panic right into the main body rushing forward. So instead of two organized units, you have one massive, terrified mob, packed shoulder to shoulder, unable to move or even see the enemy who are firing at them from the trees.
And what about the tactical failures? You mentioned Gage's advance guard.
Gage made a classic mistake. He failed to secure the high ground. The woods sloped up on either side of the path, and the French and Indian forces used that elevation perfectly. They could just rain fire down into the mass of redcoats below, picking off the officers first to destroy the chain of command.
And the British regulars, they're trained to stand in lines and fire volleys. That's useless here.
Completely useless. They're trying to stand up, load their muskets in formation, and they're just perfect targets. The enemy is invisible, fighting from behind trees and logs. Braddock is riding around trying to force them into lines, which just makes them a denser target. The whole thing just disintegrated.
Did Washington try to tell him to let the men take cover? The Virginians knew how to fight like this.
He did. Washington later said the provincial troops instinctively tried to fight from behind trees, but Braddock wouldn't have it. He saw it as cowardice. He literally rode up and beat his own men with the flat of his sword, forcing them back into the columns to be slaughtered. He chose discipline over survival.
That's the ultimate portrait of a mind that just cannot adapt.
It is. The French and Indians just kept pouring on the fire. Braddock himself showed immense courage riding all over the field, but it was pointless. He had 4 horses shot out from under him before he was mortally wounded himself, and with him went the last bit of command and control.
The outcome was a total rout. A massacre.
A decisive, catastrophic defeat. The numbers are just staggering. Out of about 1,400 men, nearly 1,000 were killed or wounded. More than 60 of his officers were casualties. The French, by contrast, had fewer than 50 men killed.
And the British just fled, leaving everything behind.
Everything. Their cannons, their supplies, their wounded, Braddock's own papers. It was one of the most ill-cited and devastating defeats in the history of the British Army.
So as soon as the news spreads, this becomes intensely personal. It's not the Battle of the Monongahela, it's Braddock's defeat.
Instantly. It's personalized because the failure of command was so total, so obvious, and his death in the action seals it. Even his burial speaks to the shame of it all. They buried him in the middle of the road they had just built.
And marched the rest of the army over his grave.
Right, to hide the body so it couldn't be found and desecrated.
Yeah.
That single image tells you everything you need to know about the scale of the failure.
And the most immediate consequence is that the entire western frontier is now completely exposed. London promised security and delivered a disaster.
The frontier was naked. The French now controlled the Ohio Valley, and they'd proven that their style of warfare, petite guerre, was superior in the woods. This changes everything for the colonists living out west.
And the raids began almost immediately.
Relentlessly. For the next 2 years, French allied war parties struck deep into Pennsylvania and Virginia. They were hitting settlements within 70 miles of Philadelphia. The commandant at Fort Duquesne was counting hundreds of scalps and prisoners. The frontier was simply collapsing.
Let's focus on Virginia's response, since that's Washington's home. What did Governor Dinwiddie and the House of Burgesses do?
They panicked, but they acted. It was a scramble for survival. They voted to raise a 1,000-man provincial regiment, a huge force for a single colony, and they appropriated 40,000 pounds to pay for it.
And this is the command that's offered to Washington.
It is. But he's learned a few hard lessons. He doesn't just accept. He negotiates. He insists on more control, better support, and a clear mandate to defend the frontier his way.
And it's important to remember this Virginia regiment was basically it. They were the only defense those settlers had for years.
Absolutely. The Redcoats never came back to Virginia during the war. The British High Command essentially wrote the area off as too difficult to defend. Washington's regiment was, as one historian put it, essentially all the security backwoods Virginians would know for the next 3 years.
And Washington himself, this whole period, was his education, his military university.
It was. The most brutal education imaginable. He's reading the European manuals, yes, but now he's comparing them to what he saw at the Monongahela. He's studying the orders of regular officers like Braddock and later Forbes, but he's learning what to adopt and, crucially, what to discard.
So what specific skills is he learning on that frontier?
He's learning the hard stuff. How to manage manpower that's never adequate to the task, how to build forts, how to organize supply lines in a wilderness, how to handle the endless paperwork of command. He's learning everything it takes to be a commander, except, as they said, the color of his coat.
So he's learning two contradictory lessons at once. He sees the need for professional discipline, like Braddock preached,
But he also sees firsthand the absolute necessity of flexibility, of adaptability, of knowing the terrain, all the things Braddock failed at.
and that tension is what makes him the commander he becomes.
It's the key. He saw that generals like Braddock, who tried to impose submission, often just convinced the colonists that the king's generals were as big a threat to their liberties as the French were. Washington learned to blend that professional discipline with a uniquely American adaptability. He synthesized failure and theory into a new kind of command.
So the Braddock campaign was this profound, bloody education, not just for Washington, but for all of Britain. They learned that European tactics were just suicidal in North America. They wanted a decisive victory, and instead they got an exposed frontier and a global war.
And Braddock's defeat cemented French predominance in the Ohio Valley. Their success was all built on local commanders like Beaujeu and their native allies, on understanding the nature of wilderness warfare. It seemed to prove that their colonial model was superior.
But, and this is the big but, that reliance on local methods is about to clash with a new French commander sent from Versailles.
Indeed. In 1756, Louis-Joseph de Montcalm arrives in Quebec, and he brings with him 6 battalions of highly trained French regulars fresh from the battlefields of Europe. Montcalm prefers European-style sieges and pitched battles, not this messy petite guerre.
It sounds like a mirror image of the British problem, a metropolitan professional clashing with colonial reality.
That's exactly what it was. Montcalm's genius was in winning battles, which he did brilliantly at first. But he had a very specific, very European idea of how the war should be fought. And that idea was often in direct conflict with the colonial governor, Vaudreuil, who understood the value of irregular warfare and Indian alliances.
So that internal conflict between Montcalm and Vaudreuil is going to shape the next phase of the war.
Montcalm will win stunning victories, like at Oswego, but the cracks in the French strategy are already beginning to show. He wins, but he does so while growing more and more distrustful of the very Canadian and Native American forces that are giving him his edge.
So if Braddock taught the British the peril of ignorance, Montcalm is about to teach the French the peril of internal strategic conflict. So next time, we're heading north to look at the strategic vision of this brilliant, conflicted general and see how the French continue their dominance in the early years of the war. Join us for French Strategy and the Genius of Montcalm.
And we'll leave you with a final thought on this. For all of Braddock's failures, the road he built wasn't forgotten. Years later, when General Forbes finally mounted the successful campaign against Fort Duquesne, he deliberately chose not to use Braddock's road. He carved a whole new path through Pennsylvania.
Why?
Because the ghost of Braddock's failure was so powerful that the only way to succeed was to reject every single thing he had done. Just think about that. How one single catastrophic failure can completely dictate all the strategy that comes after it.
Until next time.